Welcome back to Aura's Digest. This week, we want to go a little bit back to a video that we did on Bitcoin mining in Murang'a. We did this video explaining how the operations happen in Murang'a, but when I went to the comment sections, a lot of people were disappointed because they expected a definition of what is Bitcoin and exactly how the Bitcoin mining operation works. So I'm very sorry. I assumed you know about Bitcoin and what is Bitcoin. So today we're going to take it back, starting from what is Bitcoin. So for us to understand what is Bitcoin, we have to ask ourselves, what is money? So if we go back to the age of our great-grandfathers, they were using barter trade. You'd go to a market with your cows, goats, rabbits, whatever it is, and exchange that for something else. Now, that made trade to be very hard because if you have to transport cows for a very long distance, you need to feed them, you need to house them. They could be attacked by wild animals, so you had to find something else that made trade easier. Some communities started using cowrie shells as a representation. So we could say 1 cowrie shell equals 5 cows, for example. 2 is 10 cows. So if you go to a market and you're given 2 cowrie shells, you can go and exchange that to become, the 10 cows that you need. So you can travel, let's say you wanted to travel from Mombasa all the way to Mandera. So it means I don't need to carry all my cows. I'll go to some local representative, give me cowrie shells and leave my cows there. And then I could travel to Mandera and then redeem my cows on the other side. So at that case, cowrie shell acts as money. So if we were to take a small town, let's say in Kenya, and say this person is a carpenter, we have a farmer here, we have a teacher, and then you try to quantify like what value do they offer, and say in this small town, the value they offer is worth 7,000 heads of cattle, correct? So then I will go create some value in a piece of paper or whatever it is, and then distribute it to everyone. But remember, the money has to be a representation of the value, the total value in that community. So that's very important. So that's point number 1. Number 2, when trade became more sophisticated and now you needed things that would be easy to represent the type of trade that was happening all over the world, one thing emerged as a very, very good something to hold value. Remember, a cowrie shell doesn't hold value very much because you can easily pick cowrie shells from Seychelles or Malaysia and bring them to Kenya, and people wouldn't accept it. So gold became the standard money, and for very many years, because gold has 2 properties. 1, it's desirable by any human in this world because of its luster, its beauty, its ornamental value. And second of it, gold is scarce, so it cannot be easily obtained. So when you wear a gold chain or a gold ring, it represents the ornamental bright value, but also it took a lot of hard work to find this gold. So that made gold very valuable. So every time you could trade, it's very easy. You could have gold coins, which you could carry in your pocket, travel to China, make some trade. You'll find somebody in China who will accept gold. You go to somewhere in Canada, someone would accept it. You go to Fiji, someone would accept it. So gold became the standard for money, something that could be exchanged easily for something else. So gold became this valuable commodity, and that's what money is supposed to be, something valuable and scarce. Now let's talk about something else. Now, there was a king in Mali known as Mansa Musa, and he's touted as the richest guy to ever live in the world. He's so rich that he could pave the roads with gold. And there's a very famous story that he was going to Hajj in Mecca, and he passed Egypt, and he was very benevolent, and he decided to give each poor person a piece of gold, and it caused terrible inflation in Egypt. So Although gold holds that value, if everyone has it, it loses value. And that's what inflation is about, if you read about inflation. For anything to be a currency, it has to be rare. In ancient time, during the Roman times, salt used to be a currency to pay soldiers. That's where the word salary comes from. It's from the Latin word salarium. So every end of a month, the soldiers would get a block of salt. They could exchange it because mining of salt was very hard, rare, and it was needed by everyone. It could easily hold value over that. So after several years, how different types of salt were being discovered, you could get salt from the oceans and everyone else. No one would accept gold as salary in this case. So if you have something that loses value pretty fast, it cannot be money, or it loses value for money. The money as we know it today in the paper form and the currency was invented by the Chinese, I think about the 11th century. And instead of giving you a piece of gold, then they would give you a piece of paper, which then states that you could be given gold at this amount. Sort of what we refer to as a promissory note in the current terms. Transporting gold can be very bulky. So instead of transporting gold, I'd rather have a promissory note. And that's how we ended up with the current money. Now, where does Bitcoin get involved with this? That's the next step. For a very long time, all over the world, thousands for years, for each paper money that you had, it could be converted into some amount of gold. And in the US, all developed countries used what we call the gold standard, which means that if you hold $1 and walk to any bank, you could be given equivalent value of gold. And that worked very well all over the world. That wasn't until the late 19th century when Europe experienced the crazy wars that they'd never seen, where millions of people died. So the problem was that if you had currency worth, let's say the entire economy of the US is worth, let's say 1 trillion, you had to hold gold that was equivalent to that 1 million for that, because the money has to be converted into gold. When a war breaks out, you need to employ more soldiers. So you have a standing army of, let's say, 100,000 people. And all of a sudden, Germany threatens to invade you. And now you need to move from 100,000 soldiers to 1 million soldiers. You need to feed the soldiers. You need to buy a uniform for them. You need to buy weapons for them. And above that, you need to pay them for that. Now, the amount of money you have in the economy is not enough to all of a sudden pay all these people. So at that point, that's when what was referred to as fiat money got invented. Fiat is a Latin word that means let it be so. And that word was given because money had value that was tied to it. Fiat money means the government decided let it be so. We will create 5 trillion more money and use it to pay the soldiers for that. Yeah. It was necessary because the other alternative would be that now the government has to source more gold. And we already say that gold is scarce. Before the gold mines were discovered in South Africa, right, mining of gold was very rare in the world. So sourcing another 1 trillion value of gold, ship it to wherever you need, then create money of equal size to that gold will take a long time, and your enemy will already have captured you. So what you do, you say like, okay, now we have our gold reserves. We are breaking away from the gold standard. So no, you cannot take $1 to a bank and get, let's say, gold worth 500 grams, as an example. So the governments are like, okay, we'll break away from this. We'll create a currency which we can just print and print and print. And we are the ones to determine how much value that money is. We can say now $10 is worth, paying for a soldier's salary for a month or two. That's where inflation seeps into money, because for anything in the world, if there's too much of it, just like Mansa Musa, it started losing its value. Now, during the time it was necessary, especially for war purposes. But now, after the wars had ended, that aspect started getting abused, meaning that government would do something which In some world, it feels illegal, but it's not. And now, let's take a point to explain how these things work. So the government owes, for example, debt to China. Let's say the US owns it to China. Let's say the debt is worth $1 million. It gets to a point where the amount of taxes that you raise is not enough to pay those debts. So what happens at that point? Government uses another very interesting instrument. Let's say we'll print more money and use it to pay our debts. Yeah. In that world, it can be considered manipulation, but it's a standard that a lot of governments use. That's why in the Kenyan SGR debt, the Chinese insisted that the debt has to be issued in dollars because the Kenyan government cannot manipulate the dollar. It's only the US government that can manipulate the dollar. Otherwise, if the debt was the Kenyan shillings, the Kenyan government could just print more money. Yeah. It's a very convenient way of, as it said, inflating away your debt. So it became an abused process. Now, all the people who were concerned about the global money system and the domination of the dollar, you've probably heard about de-dollarization, how the dollar is a hegemony of, world finance and all that, and how the American can fight you from a money perspective without fighting you. They can just devalue your money. We print more money, flood the market, and you lose value in that case. So this is where the Bitcoiners come in. So let's explain two concepts, inflation and deflation. So let's start with inflation. So think about you've gone to the market and bought 5 cows. Then you're on your way home, you're feeling very happy. And then all of a sudden you get home and realize 2 of the cows were actually goats. So it has contracted, all that. Then you're like, oh my God, I have been conned. Okay? That's deflation, not inflation. If you bought 5 cows and on the way home, 2 of them were pregnant and they gave birth, now you have 7 cows, which means you have more. That's inflation. In the monetary supply system, it becomes a problem where there's either too much money in the market or too little money in the market. And that's why central banks exist all over the world, to manage the money supply in the market. If there's too much money in the market, prices start going up. So Bitcoin comes in and say, hey, this printing of money is causing inflation and is making government abuse the power which they've been given by the people to manage the money supply. So, like gold, the first thing is a guy known as Satoshi Nakamoto. No one knows who he is. He's just someone who wrote an academic paper and put in an idea out there and said, what we're going to do, we'll produce 21 million Bitcoins. And how you get those Bitcoins, you have to solve a very tough mathematical problem. And these are problems, for example, what is 10 times 6 divided by 7, square root of 9, exponential of 6, and all that math. So it's not a simple problem that a computer would solve in this case. It's sort of like there has to be multiple attempts. So a computer is set up with a software and it's given instructions to try and solve a problem. It's a mathematical problem. The way in school you'll be told find x. Now, as the formula becomes a bit more complex, finding x becomes hard and it takes time. It takes multiple attempts by the computer to try and solve that problem. Now, if you solve that problem successfully, you get a Bitcoin. So if you ask her, how do you get Bitcoin? You get Bitcoin by solving a mathematical problem. For you to solve this mathematical problem, you need a computer. And this computer needs power. Yeah. And you get power either from nuclear, from hydro power, from solar, and etc. So in a nutshell, you could think of Bitcoin as conversion of energy into money. And let's go back to gold. We say gold was very rare, and that's what made it a very good commodity to be used as money. Now, solving this equation set up by Satoshi Nakamoto are so difficult, and it takes a lot of time and effort and a lot of energy to solve that problem. So that essence of scarcity makes Bitcoin have value. Second, according to the Bitcoin paper, there's only be a maximum of 21 million Bitcoins that will be mined. So far, I think the guess is about like half of that has been mined yet. And there's something else that was put into the Bitcoin that as one equation gets solved, the other equation becomes even much harder to solve. So in essence, you need way more energy and more computers to solve that problem. That's why when we went to Muranga, you saw all the rigs that were set up and they're just running day and night attempting to solve those mathematical problems. So as it becomes harder to solve that problem, the scarcity part works really well. If you think about the government system to print more money, there is no limit to how much money can be printed. So in essence, from a financial perspective, you'd say Bitcoin is deflationary because inflation means way too much money in the system. Deflationary means less money. And given that Bitcoin is capped to a certain amount, which means it cannot be inflated beyond the 21 million Bitcoins that can be mined within the Bitcoin system. That has advantages and it has disadvantages. First thing, deflationary economics is good in certain scenarios. So right now, you know about the US government has hiked the interest rate to about, I think it's 5%. Because during COVID, the government decided to give a lot of money to people so that they can help them deal with job losses or other things that were happening in the economy. But what the government did not account for, they printed way too much money and inflation happened. So the government needs to deflate the economy. So how do they do that? They increase interest rates. It's a very interesting way that they do it. And in all countries in the world. So you have the government this side, which creates bonds and bills. Bonds is a request by a government to request money for a certain percentage. So they say they want a bond, and then central bank prints money. After the central bank prints money, they purchase these bonds. So that means that now the bonds are owned by the central bank, and the money the central bank printed gets moved to the government. Okay? Then now the government can use that money to start paying teachers, pay off debts, and have other social programs that they are. You might ask, isn't the government the central bank? Technically, no. That's why you have treasury and central bank. And in European countries, the central bank is very independent. They make their own decisions because they're concerned about the money supply. So the government can only make a request to the central bank or work together. So when that happens, that money gets pushed into the economy and there's more money. And that's a case where the government wants to, there's a good inflation, okay? It wants to increase money supply. Then deflation is the opposite. There's too much money in the government. So remember, central bank is still holding these bonds. So the central bank says, oh, we are selling our bonds. And then everyone in the economy, including banks, will start sucking up money from depositors and everything and buy these bonds, and the money goes to central bank. And then central bank holds on this money. So there's no longer the money that in the market. So it becomes harder to get the money. Okay, now, how do we end up with the 5% that, let's say, the US government has imposed? Banks lend themselves money, okay? And they decide, especially when you're about to run out of money and some people demanding the deposits. So this interbank rate, as it's known, its average constitutes that 5%. And through buying bonds and selling them, the central bank can affect how much money is available, and that will affect how much banks are willing to lend each other, and that becomes your interest rate. Now, Bitcoin cannot be inflated, okay? So everyone who's crazy about Bitcoin says, hey, there's no central bank that can buy or sell bonds. There's a fixed amount of Bitcoin. So in our environment, we are deflationary. It means there is less money supply. You can't increase the amount of money in the economy. That's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing when the economy is growing too fast. In most cases, inflation has been used, or printing money has been used as a means to pay war debts and other things like COVID, pandemics, and all that. But in a growing economy that's growing too fast, you need to increase the money supply. Let's say Japan in the 80s, the economy was growing way too fast, so you need to increase the money supply. So if your country is running completely off Bitcoin and all of a sudden the economy is growing too fast, let's say Kenya discovers oil in Turkana, and then we discover diamond in Wajir and something else. We need to convert those minerals into money so it can trade locally. Now, we only have 21 million Bitcoins, which means we can't have more money supply in the economy. And it's a very big problem that Bitcoin has. So in some cases, a good amount of inflation is good for that. So Bitcoiners' claim is that in our markets, governments don't interfere. So that's 101 finance, global finance, about how money works and why Bitcoin came into being. How do you make a transaction in Bitcoin? Remember, in all countries in the world, the central banks controls the money. That's why if you put your money in a bank account, the central bank can decide to hold that money or can instruct the bank to hold that money. In Bitcoin, it is decentralized, which means there is no one person in the world who controls if you can send the money or not, including the limits. Like for example, if you have more than 10,000 USD, which is about 1 million Kenya shillings, you have to declare your source of funds. In Bitcoin world, you only need, I think, 6 people, and they have what we call nodes. Nodes is just another fancy word for a server somewhere. So similar to the one in Moranga, say let's say there's another in London. So if I want to send money to you, then I'll instruct, can I send money? Then my transaction request goes to 6 people to verify that they know me and they can confirm I have this money, and then allow the transaction to take place. Yeah? That's why it's so great for drug dealers and the dark web, because as long as, and there is no request like where did you get your Bitcoin, whether I stole my Bitcoins, whether I mined them, whether I bought them, it's not the concern of this server to authenticate. The only thing it's supposed to authenticate is that I am who I say I am and I do hold this money. And as long as 6 people in the network authenticates, then the money transfer happens in this case. And it gets quite technical on how you can move the money and hide it and no one can even know that you even own this money. I'll suggest watching Billions, season 6, how this billionaire has something as a cold storage, which is a very fancy way of storing your Bitcoin. Would you need Bitcoin? Would Mama Mboga need Bitcoin? Yes and no. Yeah. Yes, the fact that you currently can set it up easily. You can just go purchase, change your Kenya shillings to Bitcoin and have it there. Mining is left to other people to do that. The people who transact with it daily, it means I have to accept Bitcoin the same way I accept M-Pesa, I accept Visa, I accept MasterCard, and all other money payment systems are there. So Bitcoin is just an alternative payment system. And as the Bitcoin heads say, that the government cannot touch. So at the end of the day, Bitcoin is just another currency. The way you can hold gold as a currency, the way you can have cowrie shells that our grandfather had, or that Maasai guy who prefers to have cattle instead of Kenya shillings in the bank account, Bitcoin is just another currency that its value is from the energy used to mine it. I hope that simplifies what is Bitcoin. It's just another money. That's it for this week. Let me know if this video explained it more or you got confused. Oh, it felt long. Yani Buddha, after kuachieve always subscribe. Apa. But you just subscribe. Hey, and I have more videos here.